The spring of 2025 brought a chill to Brussels. It wasn't the weather, though April can be unpredictable in Belgium. The chill came from Washington, D.C., carried across the Atlantic by a familiar wind of discord. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived in Brussels for a meeting with NATO allies. The official agenda: defense budgets and aid for Ukraine. The unofficial agenda: damage control. The Trump administration's foreign policy had left its mark on the transatlantic alliance, and not in a good way. Trust, once a given, was now a commodity in short supply. Rubio, known for his hawkish stance on foreign policy, found himself in the awkward position of defending the indefensible. How do you explain the inexplicable? How do you justify the unjustifiable? These were the questions that hung in the air, unspoken but ever present. The meeting rooms were filled with diplomats and dignitaries, their faces carefully composed, their words measured and polite. But beneath the veneer of civility there was a palpable sense of unease. The Brussels meeting was more than just another diplomatic gathering. It was a microcosm of the larger crisis facing the West, a crisis of identity, a crisis of purpose, a crisis of leadership. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a new and unsettling reality. The world was changing, and the question was whether the West could change with it. The official agenda was straightforward enough. NATO allies were expected to discuss their defense budgets and their commitments to Ukraine. The United States, under President Trump, had long insisted that its European partners were not spending enough on defense. The 2% of GDP target, once seen as an aspiration, was now being treated as a bare minimum. Some whispered that Trump wanted even more, perhaps as high as 5%. On the surface, there was agreement. Everyone agreed that NATO needed to be strong in the face of Russian aggression. Everyone agreed that Ukraine needed support. But beneath the surface, there were deep divisions. The Europeans resented being lectured to by a president who seemed to have little understanding of, or interest in, the complexities of European security. They pointed out that they were already increasing their defense spending, albeit from a lower base than the United States. They also noted that they were on the front lines of the confrontation with Russia, something that seemed lost on the American president. The elephant in the room, of course, was Trump himself. His erratic behavior, his disdain for alliances, his admiration for authoritarian leaders, all of this had shaken the confidence of America's allies. They no longer knew what to expect from Washington. The transatlantic relationship, once the bedrock of the post-war order, was now on shaky ground. Adding fuel to the fire was the issue of Greenland. Trump's offhand remark about buying the island from Denmark had been met with incredulity and anger in Copenhagen. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, had dismissed the idea as absurd, while the former Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, had called it an April Fool's Day joke. The Greenlandic government had also weighed in, stating unequivocally that Greenland was not for sale. The Greenland affair, though seemingly bizarre, highlighted a deeper truth about the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy, namely, that everything was transactional. Alliances, partnerships, even long-standing friendships, were all seen through the lens of deal-making. If America couldn't get what it wanted from its allies, then it would simply go it alone. The Arctic, once a region of scientific cooperation, was rapidly becoming a new arena for great power competition. Russia was expanding its military presence in the region, while China was seeking to establish a foothold. The United States, under Trump, seemed content to sit on the sidelines, more interested in scoring points against its allies than in countering its rivals. Section 4. The War in Ukraine, a House Divided. Nowhere were the divisions within NATO more apparent than on the issue of Ukraine. The war in eastern Ukraine, which had begun in 2014, was still raging, fueled by Russian arms and troops. The United States and its European allies had imposed sanctions on Russia, but the conflict had settled into a bloody stalemate. Trump's approach to Ukraine was both confusing and contradictory. On the one hand, he had provided lethal aid to the Ukrainian government, much to the chagrin of Moscow. On the other hand, he had repeatedly questioned the value of NATO and expressed admiration for Russian President Vladimir Putin. He had also alienated Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a comedian-turned-politician who had come to power on a promise to clean up corruption and end the war. Europe was caught in the middle. The European Union had been at the forefront of efforts to support Ukraine, both politically and economically. But the EU was also acutely aware of its dependence on Russia for energy and its vulnerability to Russian pressure. The bloc was divided between those who favored a tougher stance on Moscow and those who advocated for dialogue and engagement. Section 5. The price of partnership. The issue of defense spending was a perennial bone of contention between the United States and its European allies. Trump's demand that NATO members increase their defense spending to 2% of GDP had been met with a mixture of resentment and resignation. The Europeans argued that they were already contributing to NATO in other ways, such as through peacekeeping operations and humanitarian assistance. But the underlying issue was not really about money. It was about burden sharing and the future of the transatlantic alliance. Trump's America First approach to foreign policy had led to a decline in American engagement abroad. The United States was no longer seen as the guarantor of European security that it had been for decades. This had led to a debate within Europe about the need for greater strategic autonomy. The question was whether the United States was still willing to bear the costs of global leadership. Trump's actions suggested that the answer was no. He had withdrawn the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the World Health Organization. He had also imposed tariffs on goods from China, Europe, and other trading partners. These actions had alienated America's allies and emboldened its rivals. Section 6. The future of the alliance. The Brussels meeting ended as it began, with more questions than answers. The underlying tensions remained unresolved. The future of NATO was uncertain. The transatlantic alliance, once the bedrock of the post-war order, was now on shaky ground. The challenges facing NATO were real. Russia was more assertive than ever before. China was rising. The global order was in flux. But the alliance still had strengths. It had a shared history. It had a common purpose. It had a network of institutions and relationships that had been built up over decades. The question was whether NATO could adapt to the new realities of the 21st century. Could it overcome its internal divisions? Could it find a way to share burdens and responsibilities more equitably? Could it forge a new consensus on how to deal with the challenges posed by Russia, China, and other actors? The future of the West and indeed the world may depend on the answers to these questions.